This is Bluebook Digital SAT number 8, Reading and Writing Module 2. In the Indigenous intercropping system known as the Three Sisters, maize, squash, and beans form an blank web of relations. Maize provides the structure on which the bean vines grow. The squash vines cover the soil, discouraging competition from weeds. And the beans aid their two sisters by enriching the soil with essential nitrogen. So this is a complex list after the colon that proves the point. So the definition of the blank web of relations is that they're interconnected, interrelated in this way. They form an indecipherable? No. Ornamental? No. Obscure or intricate? Intricate, as in complex. From her 2021 art installation Anthem, W joined forces with singer and composer B to produce a piece that critics found truly blank. They praised T for creatively transforming a museum rotunda into a dynamic exhibit by projecting filmed images of G onto a massive 84-foot curtain and filling the space with the sounds of his and other voices singing. So if you find it, whatever goes here, that is shown by they praised it for doing all of these interesting things for how they set it up. Restrained, inventive, inexplicable, or mystifying. Inventive makes the most sense to me. I think some people might accidentally say mystifying, but mystifying means that it creates confusion. B as in boy is a better answer. They creatively, and creatively is clearly a synonym of being inventive. The author's claim about the relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is blank, as it fails to account for several recent archaeological discoveries. To be convincing, his argument would need to address recent finds of additional hominid fossils, such as the latest D specimens and Homo longi. So this word probably means is unconvincing, because it says to be convincing, it would need to address additional facts. So I would have said is shaky or of dubious validity, disorienting, tenuous, nuanced, or unoriginal. The answer is tenuous, as in uncertain in the sense of being of not absolute validity. Seminole Muskegee director S. blank television's tendency to situate native characters in the distant past. This rejection is evident in his series Reservation Dogs, which revolves around teenagers who dress in contemporary styles and whose dialogue is laced with current slang. Again, the colon sets up the explanation. So this person does something to television's tendency to do native characters in the distant past. This rejection is evident. So I think the thing that goes here would mean rejects or goes against. Repudiates, proclaims, foretells, recants. The answer is repudiates, as in rejects. The following text is adapted from Z's 1921 short story, John Redding Goes to Sea. John is a child who lives in a town in the woods. Perhaps 10-year-old John was puzzling to the folk there in the Florida woods, for he was an imaginative child and fond of daydreams. The St. John River flowed a scarce 300 feet from his back door. On its banks at this point grew numerous palms, luxuriant magnolias, and bay trees. On the bosom of the stream float millions of delicately colored hyacinths. John Redding loved to wander down to the water's edge and, casting in dry twigs, watch them sail away downstream to Jacksonville, the sea, the wide world, and he wanted to follow them. Which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? So this final sentence. He cast in dry twigs to the water's edge, watched them sail downstream to Jacksonville, the sea, the wide world, and he wanted to follow them. Provides an extended description of a location that John likes to visit. No. Reveals that some residents of John's towns are confused by his behavior. Well, that can't be that, because that's not in the underlined part. It illustrates the uniqueness of John's imagination compared to the imaginations of other children. I don't think so, because it doesn't mention other children there. It suggests that John longs to experience a larger life outside the Florida woods. He wanted to follow them downstream, sort of metaphorically down the stream to the land beyond. Interesting. When companies in the same industry propose merging with one another, they often claim that the merger will benefit consumers by increasing efficiency and therefore lowering prices. Economist Y.F. investigated this notion in the context of the United States newspaper market. She modeled a hypothetical merger of Minneapolis area newspapers and found that subscription prices would rise following a merger. Subscription prices would rise. So if two companies get together, people would actually have to pay more. Okay? Economists DF and FP have argued that research on the effect of mergers on prices has focused excessively on short-term effects, which tend to be adverse for consumers, as in tend to be negative for consumers, okay, which matches what text 1 said. Using the case of consumer banking in Italy, they show that over the long term, several years in their study, the efficiency gains realized by merged companies do result in economic benefits for consumers. So the people in 2 say it's adverse in the beginning but has economic benefits in the long term. Based on the text, how would F and P text 2 most likely respond to F's findings? They would recommend that F compare the near-term effect of a merger on subscription prices in the Minneapolis area with the effect of a merger in another newspaper market. No, it's not another market. It's near-term versus long-term effects. They would argue that over the long term, the expenses incurred by the merged newspaper company will also increase. No, that's a trick wrong answer. The expenses incurred by the company will also increase? No, it would have to be that somehow there are benefits to consumers in the long term. They would encourage F to investigate whether the projected effect on subscription prices persists over an extended period. I think that's the answer, yeah. Persists as in lasts. So they would say, sure, in the short term prices go up, but do they stay that way in the long term? They would claim that mergers have a different effect on consumer prices in the newspaper. No. The following text is adapted from Lewis Carroll's 1889 satirical novel, Sylvie and Bruno. A crowd has gathered outside a room belonging to the warden, an official who reports to the Lord Chancellor. The warden reports to the Lord Chancellor, okay? One man, who was more excited than the rest, flung his hat high into the air and shouted, as well as I could make out, "Who roar for the sub-warden?" Everybody roared, but whether it was for the sub-warden or not did not clearly appear. Some were shouting bread and some taxes, but no one seemed to know what it was they really wanted. All this I saw from the open window of the warden's breakfast saloon, looking across the shoulder of the Lord Chancellor. What can it all mean? He kept repeating to himself. I never heard such shouting before, and at this time of the morning, too, and with such unanimity. What a strange passage. How does the Lord Chancellor respond to the crowd? So just to be clear, looking across the shoulder of the Lord Chancellor, and then the Lord Chancellor is the one who says, what can it all mean? Because the he right here points to the Lord Chancellor. Okay. He asks about the meaning of the crowd shouting, even though he claims to know what the crowd wants. Well, this part matches with the first part. What can it all mean? So that's asking about the meaning of the crowd shouting, but he claims to know what the crowd wants? I don't think so. He indicates a desire to speak to the crowd, even though the crowd is asked to speak. Definitely does not indicate a desire to speak to them. Because you're looking at this quote, and this quote only is how he responds. He expresses sympathy for the crowd's demands, even though the crowd's shouting annoys him. I don't think so. There's no sympathy with their demands, so it should be the last one, I hope. He describes the crowd as being united, even though the crowd clearly appears otherwise. Yeah, so this is why you always have to read to the very end. With such unanimity. With such unanimity, of course, is united. And then from earlier up here, you could say the crowd appears to be not united because people were shouting different things and no one seemed to know what they really wanted. A strange passage. Voters' political orientation, level of political information, and probability of voting. So as you go from strong Democrat liberal to strong Republican, whether you have low information or high information, you sort of see it come down and then go back up. Okay? Economists KKC and M.S. Jr. investigate a variety of factors that influence voter turnout in the U.S., using survey data that revealed whether respondents voted in national elections and how knowledgeable respondents are about politics. C&S claim that the likelihood of voting is driven in part by potential voters' confidence in their assessments of candidates. Essentially, the more informed voters are about politics, the more confident they are at evaluating whether candidates share their views, and thus the more likely they are to vote. Let me say this last part again. The more informed voters are about politics, the more confident they are at evaluating whether candidates share their views, and thus the more likely they are to vote. So if people are better informed, which I think is high information rather than low information, then they can figure out whether the politicians share what they want, share their views, and then they therefore vote more often. Okay? Which choice best describes data in the graph that support their claim? And the claim is the likelihood of voting is driven in part by voters' confidence in their assessments of candidates. Sure, dash, and is what we just said. At each point on the political orientation scale, high information voters were more likely than low information voters to vote. That seems good to me, right? So the black bars are always higher than the gray bars. The people with more information, who are the more informed ones, can more confidently figure out whether politicians share their views, and therefore they vote more. So I think it's A, but let's go through all four. Only low information voters who identify as independents had a voting probability below 50%. Well, I guess that actually is true, but that's not the answer. That's not the general trend. The closer that low information voters are to the ends of the political orientation scale, the more likely they were to vote. Again, that's true, but doesn't prove the point, because you have to compare the people who are more informed with less informed. High information voters were more likely to identify as strong Democrats or strong Republicans than low information voters. No, it's not whether they're partisan, it's whether they vote based on having more information. So A is the best answer. The largest tyrannosaurids, the family of carnivorous dinosaurs that includes T, A, and most famously T-Rex, are thought to have had the strongest bites of any land animals in Earth's history. Determining the bite force of extinct animals can be difficult, however, and paleontologists Paul Barrett and Emily Rayfield have suggested that an estimate of dinosaur bite force may be significantly influenced by the methodology used in generating that estimate. An estimate of their bite force may be significantly influenced by the methodology used in generating that estimate. So they're saying the way you figure out the bite force changes what you say the bite force is, because you're looking at the muscular and skeletal modeling gives you the first and the last rows, which is 35 to 63, 35 to 57. Yeah, so the muscular and skeletal modeling is very similar. But then the tooth-bone interaction gives you a much lower minimum number. And then the body mass scaling gives you a much, much higher number. Okay. Which choice best describes data from the table that support Barrett and Rayfield's suggestion? The study by Mears used body mass scaling and produced the lowest estimated maximum bite force. Well, that's just wrong, because the Mears is the highest estimated, so no. In their study, G and E used tooth-bone interaction analysis to produce an estimated bite force range with a minimum of 8,000, maximum of 30. Well, that's true, but not the answer, right? Because that doesn't prove that the different ways of figuring it out affected what number you came up with. The bite force estimates produced by Bates and Falkingham and by Cost et al. Were similar to each other. So Bates and Falkingham and Cost et al., yeah, those are both the muscular and skeletal people. While the estimates produced by Mears and by G and E differed substantially from any other estimate. Yeah, I think so, right? So the muscular and skeletal are the same, and then this is way different, and this is way different. Sure. The estimated maximum bite force produced by Cost et al. Exceeded the estimated maximum bite produced by B and F, even though both groups of researchers used the same method to generate Bates et al. By Bates and Falkingham and Cost et al. Well, no, that's just wrong, right? So Cost et al. Exceeded the maximum. Well, yeah, okay, so it slightly exceeded it, but it's still, these are very, very close to each other. So, and they're also still the same methodology. So C isn't counted as the answer. When digging for clams, their primary food, sea otters damage the roots of eelgrass plants growing on the seafloor. Near Vancouver Island in Canada, the otter population is large and well established, yet the eelgrass meadows are healthier than those found elsewhere off Canada's coast. To explain this, conservation scientists E.F. and colleagues compared the Vancouver Island meadows to meadows where otters are absent or were reintroduced only recently. Finding that the Vancouver Island meadows have a more diverse gene pool than the others do, Foster hypothesized that damage to eelgrass roots increases the plant's rate of sexual reproduction. This in turn boosts genetic diversity, which benefits the meadow's overall health. Which finding, if true, would most directly undermine, as in go against her hypothesis. So the hypothesis is damage to eelgrass roots increases the plant's rate of sexual reproduction. So if the otters damage the eelgrass, that actually makes the eelgrass reproduce more quickly, which increases its genetic diversity, which benefits it overall. So the theory is otters rustling up the seagrass actually makes the seagrass stronger. Okay, which one would go against that? At some sites in the study, eelgrass meadows are found near otter populations that are small and have only recently been introduced. I don't think so. At several sites not included in the study, there are large, well-established sea otter populations, but no eelgrass meadows. That's not jumping out at me either. At several sites not included in the study, eelgrass meadows' health correlates negatively with the length of residence and size of sea otter populations. Yes, because that means correlates negatively, as in one goes up, one goes down. So C is saying if you have more otters, eelgrass gets less healthy, which is the exact opposite of what's highlighted in pink. The highlighted in pink is when the otters damage it, that actually makes it more healthy. Let's be thorough and look at the fourth one. At some sites in the study, the health of plants unrelated to eelgrass correlates negatively with the length of residence. Well, no, that's just other plants, so it doesn't apply. So it's C. In the 20th century, ethnographers made a concerted effort to collect Mexican-American folklore, but they did not always agree about the folklore's origins. Scholars such as A.E. claim that Mexican-American folklore derived largely from the folklore of Spain, which ruled Mexico in what is now the southwestern United States from the 16th to the early 19th centuries. Scholars such as A.P., by contrast, argue that while some Spanish influence is undeniable, Mexican-American folklore is mainly the product of the ongoing interactions of various cultures in Mexico and the United States. Which finding, if true, would most directly support P's argument? So P is this person at the end. I'm going to say that person's argument again. While some Spanish influence is undeniable, Mexican-American folklore is mainly the product of the ongoing interactions of various cultures in Mexico and the United States. So P says that what's really happening is Mexico and the U.S. are interacting right now, and it's not the remnants from Spain being there in the past. Okay? The folklore that the ethnographers collected includes several songs written in the form of a decima, a type of poem originating in late 6th. No, definitely not that one. Much of the folklore that the ethnographers collected had similar elements from region to region. I don't think so. Most of the folklore that the ethnographers collected was previously unknown to scholars. That doesn't seem to match with it's the product of ongoing interactions between Mexico and U.S. Most of the folklore that the ethnographers collected consisted of corridos, ballads about history and social life of a clearly recent origin. That seems to make the most sense, right? Of a clearly recent origin definitely matches with the word ongoing. Yeah, it must be that. Doesn't jump out super obvious, but from the answer choices, it must be that. Average survival of fruit flies following infection. In a study of the evolution of, I'm just going to say, A and B genes encoding antimicrobial peptides that can combat pathogens and foster beneficial microbes in fruit flies, researchers assessed DM resistance to pathogenic infections by PR and AS, bacteria common in the fly's environments. Subjects included flies identified by mutation silencing AB or both A and B, term types AB and AB respectively. In conjunction with the observation that resistance to PR correlates with A activity but is not significantly affected by B activity, data in the graph of survival rates post-AS infection suggests that... This is an extremely dense question. I'm going to start at the very end. Data in the graph of survival rates post-AS infection. So I think what they're saying is this chart is the A. Cicerae infection. That's what this chart is showing. So the in conjunction with, I'm just going to set aside. I'm going to set that completely aside, just ignore that. So data in the graph of survival rates post-A infection suggests that. Now, just to clarify, A, B, and AB mean that those genes are silenced. So if you look at the chart, right, silencing A basically does not change survival rate. But silencing B does change survival rate. And then silencing A and B also changes survival rate pretty much the same way. So if you get rid of element B, whatever it is, you get rid of the gene B, then the fruit flies die from the infection. So my take from this, even though it's an extremely tough question, is that the B thing is super, super important in the survival of the flies. That's my best guess as to how to do this. So A confers defense against regardless of the presence. I don't think so. B protects against only one bacteria species, whereas A protects against multiple species. I don't think so. B may have developed as a specific defense against. Well, that at least makes sense to me in light of the chart. So if the chart is showing just the A cicerae, and A seems to have no effect, B changes it. So that seems the best one so far. Defense against AS is strongest when both are present. But there is no both present, right? Because that would be the control that does not exist. They're only showing you when A is absent, when they're both absent, or when B is absent, so it can't be that one. I think it's C as in cap, and I'm going to try to talk through why it's not the first couple. Confers defense regardless of the presence of. It's definitely not that one, because it's a monster question. I'm going to move on from this question. I think it's C, but this is one of the toughest questions I have ever seen on an SAT. But that happens, right? Even as somebody who's been a tutor for a long, long time, you just get monster questions, especially on the verbal. Some economists have attributed that the increasing adoption of automation technology by firms in the U.S. in part to the productivity gains firms can achieve by automating tasks previously requiring paid labor. D.A. et al. Recently complicated this account by showing not only that automation's productivity gains are often unremarkable, but that there is a disparity in the U.S. tax code between automation technology and the labor it is nominally equivalent to. The tax code classifies automation-related technology as a depreciating asset, meaning that capital expenditures on the technology can reduce a firm's tax burden relative to its tax burden if equivalent expenditures were labor costs. Together, these findings suggest that... I'm going to try to paraphrase this passage. So, of course, you can... Increasing adoption of automation, right, can replace human labor. Sure, of course. But these people say it's not that simple. They complicate that by showing two things. Not only that, the productivity gains are often unremarkable. So what you gain in productivity is actually not that great. And then also, there is a disparity in the U.S. tax code between automation technology and the labor it's equivalent to. So something to do with how the tax code lets you define things differently. Let's see. Which suggests that these findings suggest that the explanation that some economists have offered for U.S. firms' increasing adoption of automation technology may be based on an overestimation of the tax benefits and productivity associated with that technology. I think it's an overestimation of the productivity gains. I don't think it's an overestimation of the tax benefits. I think the fact that there are tax benefits is the nuanced explanation. It's not that they're overestimating the tax benefits, it's that there are actually tax benefits, and that's the thing that matters. U.S. firms' increasing adoption of automation technology may be driven more by the fact that the government indirectly incentivizes firms to adopt that technology than by the ongoing benefits that the technology has for firms' outputs. Yeah, I think that's the answer, right? So the second part is that the gains are often unremarkable. That's by the ongoing benefits that the technology has for firms' outputs. It's actually more important that they use the tax code to their advantage. I think it's that one, but let's keep going. Changes to the U.S. tax code that result in capital expenditures and automation technology being treated the same as expenditure on labor costs would likely have little effect on firms' productivity, but may encourage further adoption of that technology. No. That's like speculating about what would happen in a different scenario, but it doesn't give you that information. U.S. firms have actually tended to experience a decrease in productivity as a result of adopting automation technology, but that decrease is overlooked due to the tax advantage. No. There are some gains, they're just unremarkable, right? As in not that much. So it's B as in boy. The morphological novelty of echinoderms, marine invertebrates with radial symmetry, usually star-like, around the central point, impedes comparisons with most other animals, in which bilateral symmetry on an anterior-posterior head-to-tail axis through a trunk is typical. Particularly puzzling are sea stars, thought to have evolved a headless layout from a known bilateral origin. Applying genomic knowledge of SK acorn worms, close relatives of sea stars and thus expected to have similar markers for corresponding anatomical regions, to the body patterning genes of PM sea stars, LF et al. Observed activity only in anterior genes across PM's entire body and some posterior genes limited to the edges, suggesting that. So we're in the zone of very, very difficult verbal and reading questions because we got them all correct on the first passage. It's tough for me to process this on the first read through. They're assumed to have evolved a headless layout from a known bilateral origin. So it's assumed that you used to be a normal type of creature like a person where you have bilateral symmetry, and then over time they got rid of having a head. Okay. And then this person applies the study and finds activity only in anterior genes across the entire body and some posterior genes limited to the edges. So that person finds the genes only in anterior, posterior, head to tail. I need to look at the answer choices here. Despite the greater prevalence of anterior genes in sea star genetic makeup, posterior genes active at the body's perimeter are primarily responsible for the star-like layout that distinguishes sea stars' radial symmetry from that of other echinoderms. That doesn't jump out to me. Let's see. Contrary to the belief that they evolved from early ancestors with the bilateral form typical of many other animals, sea stars instead originated with an atypical body layout that was neither bilaterally nor radially symmetrical. That doesn't jump out to me either. Neither bilaterally nor radially symmetrical. That doesn't make sense based on that passage, but based on this little quote, but let's keep going. Although the two species are closely related, there is only minimal correspondence in the genetic markers for head, tail, and trunk regions development between. Well, that's not really the point. The point is to suggest, it's to somehow make an inference about how sea stars got their shape. So I don't think it's that. Rather than undergoing changes resulting in the eventual elimination of a head region in their radial body plan, as previously assumed, sea stars' morphology evolved to completely lack a trunk and consist primarily of a head region. Maybe. Actually, now that I think about it, that sort of makes sense. I'm going to have to go back and match this, though. So, okay, in most other animals, bilateral symmetry on an anterior-posterior head-to-tail axis through a trunk is typical. So in most other creatures, you have a head, a trunk, and a tail, right? A head, a trunk, and a tail. And then they found only the head and the edge, suggesting that rather than undergoing changes resulting in the eventual elimination of a head region in the radial body plan, as previously assumed, sea stars' morphology evolved to completely lack a trunk. I think I see what they're saying, is that the head became the entire organism. They got rid of the trunk. So only in anterior genes across its entire... Now it makes sense, yeah. Only in anterior genes across its entire body So the anterior is the head across its entire body, which implies that the entire thing ended up being the head, and that's how sea stars evolved. A really hard question. I think it's D, though. Interest in mechanotransduction, the mechanism by which cells sense and convert mechanical stimuli into biochemical signals, is expanding because of innovative work by biomedical scientists, many of whom, like neuroscience and biophysics expert Elba Serrano, blank this mechanism to better understand how the body's neurological and biomechanical systems interact. So, many of those researchers, I would have said, are studying. Oh, okay, that's not an answer choice. So, is studying, has studied, study, or studies? Well, it has to be study, right? Because many of plural, right, is the work by the biomedical scientists, plural. Many of whom, like that one person, are studying or study. Researchers studying magnetosensation have determined why some soil-dwelling roundworms in the southern hemisphere move in the opposite direction of Earth's magnetic field when searching for blank. In the northern hemisphere, the magnetic field points downward into the ground, but in the southern hemisphere, it points up toward the surface and away from worms' food sources. Isn't this the explanation, right? So they've determined why. Yeah, and this is why, which seems like it should just be A. Right, the colon sets up the explanation. Definitely not B, because that would be a comma splice. This would create a run-on, and this would blur it together. As cheese-making practices spread throughout Europe and Asia during and after the Neolithic, divergent strategies for preserving milk blank. Whereas rennet coagulated cheesemaking became key to milk preservation in Europe and Southwest Asia, acid heat coagulation methods became common among nomadic herding populations of the northeastern Eurasian steppe. Well, this is definitely its own full sentence. It's definitely not D as in dog, because that would be a comma splice, right? The comma would be attempting to conjoin two full sentences. It seems like it may just be another colon setting up the whole explanation. So divergent strategies emerged, and then it shows the two divergent strategies. Definitely not blurring it together. Yeah, it's C. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass first appeared in 1855 as a slim collection of 12 poems, but Whitman would revise and expand it substantially over the next 4 decades. These extensive blank, the addition of hundreds of new poems, the removal of some existing ones, and the insertion of prefatory material reflected the poet's evolving literary perspective and experience of the U.S. Civil War. You always have to read the whole thing. Notice that when you get down to here, it sort of surprises you by having basically a main verb in that later sentence. I'm going to read it with A. These extensive changes, including the addition of hundreds of new poems, the removal of some existing ones, and the insertion of prefatory material, reflected the poet. Yeah, that's the answer, but the others will be wrong. Let's read it with B. These extensive changes would include A, B, and C, reflected. Well, no. And no, it's actually this, but you have to read it all the way down to here for it to click. So B and C are wrong for the same reason, and that's very wrong. English poet and Shakespeare contemporary John Donne's blank, much admired during his lifetime and in the decades that followed, had, at the time of their enthusiastic rediscovery by the early 20th century modernists, been essentially gathering dust for the intervening 250 years. Again, you always have to read the whole thing because it's designed to deceive you. A lot of people would accidentally say A, but of course it's not A. Let me say it with A. English poet and Shakespeare contemporary John Donne's works were much admired during his lifetime and in the decades that followed. Yeah, up until there, it's great, but then you can't continue after that the way it's written. So it's actually this. That's a really advanced phrasing. It turns everything between the commas into a big adjective, basically. Let me say it with the right answer. English poet and Shakespeare contemporary John Donne's works, much admired during his lifetime and in the decades that followed, had, at the time of their enthusiastic rediscovery by the early 20th century modernists, been essentially gathering dust for the intervening 250 years. It's a really tough question. Researchers studying the Terracotta Army, the thousands of life-size statues of warriors found interred near the tomb of Emperor Q.sh of China were shocked to realize that the shape of each statue's ears, like the shape of each person's ears, blank unique. This is just grammar. This is eliminating the prepositional phrase. So the actual subject that's doing the being unique is shape, because everything from here to here is a big prepositional phrase. The shape is unique. The shape of whatever is unique. The shape of those 10,000 things is unique. It's actually a singular verb. A firefly uses specialized muscles to draw oxygen into its lower abdomen through narrow tubes, triggering a chemical reaction whereby the oxygen combines with chemicals in the firefly's abdomen to produce a glow. Blank. When the firefly stops drawing in oxygen, the reaction and the glow cease. So it draws the oxygen in, and that causes the glow. Then when the firefly stops drawing in, the glow ceases, as in stops. For instance, by contrast, specifically in conclusion, which is by contrast, right? So it's doing its thing, which causes it to glow. By contrast, when it stops doing its thing, the glowing stops. Upon first approaching artist KW's DSE ray, a colorful scene painted on the surface of a cobblestone street in Mantua, Italy, one might assume a deep hole filled with life-size, classically styled sculptures had opened up on the street. Blank, by expertly applying the principles of perspective, Wenner created merely the illusion of depth. So you're looking at the thing on the street and you assume that it's a deep hole filled with sculptures, but it's merely an illusion. So notice that I said the word but, which it has to be on the contrary. It's not additionally, as a result, or next. Yeah. Wants to emphasize the distance covered by the Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike. So whatever the answer is, it has to be the turnpike was 72 miles long. Wow. The 62-mile-long Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike connected. It seems like it is just that, unless I'm crazy. The Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike was the first part. No. The Philadelphia and Lancaster Turnpike, which connects to. No. A historic Pennsylvania road. No. It has to be that, because that's the only one that says a length. I just happen to have bizarrely almost said the number off the top of my head. Wants to explain the advantage of the women in the vote format. Explain the advantage of the women in the vote format. Women in the Vote featured a drawing of a Victorian-style house with several rooms, each containing suffrage artifacts. Well, that doesn't make clear that it's an advantage. To access video clips, songs, artwork, and text, audiences had to first... No. The Women in the Vote format appealed to audiences because it allowed them to control the experience. Seems like it. Using an interactive format, theater students at Radford and Virginia Tech created Women in the Vote, a play about... Yeah, but that's not the benefit of the Women in the Vote format. So the appealed to audiences because matches with the advantage, the benefit. Wants to refute a claim that malapportionment in the sorting favors small urban districts. Refute a claim that malapportionment in the sorting favors small urban districts, as in disprove that distributing the materials badly favors small urban districts. Less populated rural districts are disproportionately underrepresented in the sorting, creating an unfair advantage for smaller but more populated urban districts. No, that actually confirms that it favors urban districts, right? That because it says an unfair advantage for smaller but more populated urban, so it's not that one. It's untrue that malapportionment in the 169-seat sorting favors small urban districts. Rather, the formula for distributing seats overrepresents more populated districts. Maybe, but let's keep going. A common feature of representative governments, malapportionment occurs... Well, no, because that doesn't talk about the small urban versus other types of districts. Awarding more points per unit of land than points per resident. The formula for distributing sorting seats overrepresents less populated rural districts with large tracts of land. That also sounds good to me. So I think this might be one of those where these tough questions where you actually have to look back at the data. So it's definitely either B as in boy or D as in dog. So Let's look at B again. It's untrue that malapportionment in the sorting favors small urban districts. Rather, the formula for distributing seats overrepresents more populated districts. Is that true, though? So how does it actually work? Seats are distributed by a formula that awards 1 point per resident and 1.8 points per unit of land. So it's not B as in boy, right? Because it actually gives you more points for land. So it gives you more points for the size, right? So like if it were the U.S., Alaska would end up with way more than New York because of its size. So it does not overrepresent more populated. So it has to be D as in dog, but let's confirm. Awarding more points per unit of land, yes. Yeah, than points per resident. The formula for distributing sorting seats overrepresents less populated rural districts with large tracts of land. Yes, and of course, that disproves that it favors small urban districts. Wants to present the study and its methodology, as in show what it did and how it went about figuring that out. A study revealed that ducklings, which expend up to 62.8% less energy when swimming in a line behind their mother, also experience... That doesn't say the methodology. It doesn't say how they studied it. Seeking to understand how ducklings swimming in a line behind their mother save energy, ZY used computer simulations to study the effect of the mother duck's wake. Yeah, the using computer simulations is the methodology, but let's leave that. ZY studied the physics behind the fact that by being pushed in a forward direction by waves, ducklings save energy. I think that might be true, but that's not necessarily this particular study here. Naval architect ZY discovered that ducklings are pushed in a forward direction. No, so that's the outcome of the study. Let's try and better explain why it's not... Well, B is the right answer, I think, but why is it not C? Study the physics behind the fact that by being pushed in a forward direction by waves, they save energy. I think that's a very slight misreading of the facts, right? The physics hasn't been well understood, and then he studied it, but I don't think he studied the physics behind the fact. And B as in boy also is a much better definition of a methodology. How he went about doing it, he used computer simulations to study it. Wants to emphasize the aim of the research study. Emphasize the aim, as in what was their goal? What did they set out to prove? TR and FLR, researchers of Wichita State, wanted to know if woodland expansion is related to changes in climate. That is an aim, okay? Thanks to the work done by them, we now know... No, that's not the aim. Wichita State University researchers have determined that... No, that's not the aim. TR and FLR analyzed core samples from oak trees on site. Yeah. No, that's what they did. But the aim is they wanted to know something.